Let us begin our journey in a small town in France. A town called La Haye-en-Touraine, now known as Descartes, in honor of the man we will come to know tonight. It is the year 1596, and on the 31st of March, a child is born. His name is René Descartes. The world into which René entered was one of transition. France, at the close of the 16th century, was emerging from the turmoil of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. The wars of religion, which had ravaged the country for decades, were drawing to a close. King Henry IV, a Protestant who had converted to Catholicism to secure the throne, had issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, just 2 years after René's birth. This edict granted a degree of religious tolerance to the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and brought a measure of peace to the realm. René's father, Joachim Descartes, was a member of the petty nobility and served as a councillor in the Parliament of Brittany. This meant that young René was born into a family of some standing, though not of great wealth or prominence. His mother, Jeanne Brochard, came from a respectable family as well. But tragedy would mark René's earliest days. His mother died when he was just over 1 year old, likely from complications following the birth of another child. This child, René's younger sibling, did not survive long either. And so, the infant René was left motherless, raised by his grandmother and a nurse. His father, occupied with his duties in Rennes, the capital of Brittany, was often absent. This early loss, this absence of maternal warmth, may have shaped something in the young boy's character, but this is speculation. What we know with certainty is that René was a frail child, prone to illness, and that his caregivers worried greatly about his health. Despite his physical weakness, or perhaps because of it, René developed a keen and curious mind. He was encouraged to rest, to stay in bed late into the mornings, a habit that he would maintain throughout his life. In those quiet morning hours, lying in the stillness of his room, the young René would think. He would wonder. He would observe the patterns of light filtering through the windows, the sounds of the household awakening around him. When René was around 10 years old, his father arranged for him to attend the Jesuit college at La Flèche. This was one of the most prestigious educational institutions in France, founded by King Henry IV himself in 1603. The Jesuits, members of the Society of Jesus, were known for their rigorous intellectual training and their commitment to education. They sought to cultivate both the mind and the spirit, blending classical learning with Catholic theology. At La Flèche, René was given special permission, owing to his delicate health, to remain in bed in the mornings. While other students rose early for prayers and lessons, René was allowed to rest, to lie quietly, and to think. This privilege, granted out of concern for his well-being, became a formative practice. In those solitary morning hours, René cultivated the habit of meditation, of turning his thoughts inward, of examining ideas with careful attention. The curriculum at La Flèche was comprehensive. Students studied Latin and Greek, the classical languages that opened the door to the great works of antiquity. They read the poets, the historians, the philosophers of Rome and Greece. They studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. They learned mathematics, geometry, and the rudiments of the sciences, as they were understood at the time. But the heart of the Jesuit education was philosophy. Students were trained in the scholastic tradition, the philosophical system that had dominated European thought for centuries. This tradition was built upon the works of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, as interpreted and synthesized by medieval Christian thinkers, most notably Thomas Aquinas. According to the scholastic view, knowledge could be attained through the use of reason applied to the evidence of the senses. The physical world, the world of matter and change, was seen as the realm where truth could be discovered. Aristotle had taught that all knowledge begins with sensory experience. We see, we hear, we touch, we taste, we smell, and from these sensations, the mind abstracts universal truths. The scholastics also believed that philosophical inquiry should serve theological ends. Reason and faith were seen as complementary, two paths leading to the same ultimate truth, which was God. The natural world was understood as a reflection of divine wisdom, and to study nature was to glimpse the mind of the Creator. René absorbed these teachings. He was an excellent student, mastering the curriculum with apparent ease. He excelled in mathematics, finding in its clear and certain demonstrations a kind of beauty and reliability. But even as he learned, even as he demonstrated his aptitude, something within him began to stir. A question, quiet at first, began to form in his mind. The question was this: how much of what he was being taught was truly certain? How much was merely opinion, tradition, or unexamined assumption? René read the ancient texts. He studied the arguments of the great philosophers. And yet, on so many fundamental questions, these thinkers disagreed with one another. One would assert one thing, another would assert the opposite. Both would offer reasons, both would construct elaborate arguments, and yet certainty eluded them. This troubled the young René. If the wisest minds in history could not agree on the most basic questions of existence and knowledge, what hope was there for finding truth? Was all of human learning simply a collection of competing opinions, none more valid than another? Mathematics offered a contrast. In geometry, in arithmetic, there were proofs. There were demonstrations that compelled the mind to accept their conclusions. No one debated whether the angles of a triangle summed to 2 right angles, or whether 2 plus 2 equaled 4. These truths were self-evident, or demonstrable with complete certainty. René began to wonder, could other areas of knowledge be placed on a similar foundation? Could philosophy, could the sciences, be rebuilt according to the model of mathematics? Could there be a method, a procedure, that would lead to certainty in all matters? These questions formed in the quiet of his morning meditations, in the halls and chapels of La Flèche, would occupy René for the rest of his life. But for now, they were merely stirrings, the first faint movements of a mind beginning to awaken to its own power. René completed his studies at La Flèche in 1614 or 1615, at around the age of 18 or 19. He had spent 8 or 9 years at the college, years of intensive study and intellectual formation. He had been trained in the best that the European tradition had to offer, and yet he would later write that, upon leaving La Flèche, he found himself embarrassed with so many doubts and errors that he felt he had gained nothing from his education except the knowledge of his own ignorance. This was not ingratitude. René had great respect for his teachers and for the institution that had shaped him, but he had come to a realization that would set him on a path unlike any taken by his contemporaries. He realized that knowledge, true knowledge, could not be inherited. It could not be accepted on authority, no matter how venerable that authority might be. True knowledge, René believed, must be discovered anew by each individual mind. It must be founded on principles so clear and certain that doubt is impossible. And to find these principles, one must be willing to set aside everything one has been taught, to start from the beginning, to doubt everything, until one finds something that cannot be doubted. After leaving La Flèche, René went to the University of Poitiers, where he studied law. This was a practical course of study, the sort of thing expected of a young man of his class. In 1616, he received his license in both canon and civil law. But René had no intention of becoming a lawyer. The law was the profession of his father, and perhaps Joachim, hoped his son would follow in his footsteps. But René's mind was elsewhere. He was drawn to the world, to experience, to the great stage of human affairs. He wanted to test himself, to see how the lessons of his education stood up to the realities of life. And so, in 1618, at the age of 22, René enlisted as a volunteer in the army of Prince Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch Republic. Why the army? This might seem an odd choice for a young intellectual with a delicate constitution. But military service for a nobleman was an honourable pursuit. It offered travel, adventure, and the opportunity to observe the wider world. And crucially, the armies of the time, particularly in the Dutch Republic, offered something else. Periods of relative inactivity, of waiting, of leisure, time to think. René did not seek combat. He was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He joined as a gentleman volunteer, a status that allowed him to move with the army, to observe, to learn, without being bound by the strict discipline imposed on common soldiers. It was, in a sense, a continuation of his education by other means. It was in the Dutch Republic, in the city of Breda, that René encountered a man who would change his life. His name was Isaac Beeckman, a Dutch philosopher and scientist. Beeckman was older than René by about 12 years, and he possessed a lively and inquiring mind. He was interested in mathematics, in physics, in the application of mathematical principles to the study of nature. The two men met by chance. René saw a notice, written in Flemish, posted on a wall. It posed a mathematical challenge to anyone who could solve it. Unable to read Flemish, René asked a passerby to translate. That passerby was Isaac Beeckman. Intrigued by René's interest, Beeckman translated the problem. René solved it almost immediately. This was the beginning of a friendship. Beeckman and Descartes, as we will now begin to call René by his Latinized surname, spent hours together discussing mathematics, physics, and the nature of knowledge. Beeckman encouraged Descartes to pursue his own investigations, to apply his mathematical skill to the study of the physical world. Descartes began to work on problems in mechanics and in music theory. He explored the mathematics of falling bodies, the nature of sound, the principles of harmony. Beeckman's influence was profound. He awakened in Descartes the realization that mathematics was not merely an abstract discipline, but a tool that could unlock the secrets of nature. In a notebook he kept, Descartes wrote that Beeckman alone roused me from my state of indolence and reawakened the learning which by then had almost slipped from my memory. This was high praise, and it speaks to the importance of this encounter. Beeckman had given Descartes a vision of what philosophy could be, not a scholastic exercise in interpreting ancient texts, but a dynamic, creative endeavor aimed at discovering new truths about the world. But Descartes' time in the Dutch Republic was relatively brief. In 1619, he left the service of Prince Maurice and travelled to Germany, where he joined the army of Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria. Europe was on the brink of a great conflict, the 30 Years' War, which would devastate much of the continent. Descartes found himself once again in the company of soldiers, in a world on the edge of chaos. It was during this time, in the winter of 1619 to 1620, that Descartes experienced a series of dreams that he would later describe as pivotal to his life's work. He was quartered in a small town, sheltering from the cold in what he called a stove-heated room. There, alone, with time to think, Descartes spent the day of November the 10th, 1619, in deep meditation. What exactly occupied his thoughts that day, we cannot know with complete certainty, but Descartes himself tells us that he had a kind of revelation, a vision of a new method for unifying all the sciences under the banner of mathematics. He saw, or believed he saw, the outline of a universal system of knowledge, built on principles as certain as those of geometry. That night, Descartes had 3 vivid dreams. In the first, he found himself beset by phantoms and buffeted by a great wind, which pushed him toward the chapel of a college. He tried to greet someone he passed, but was unable to do so because the wind kept forcing him back. In the second dream, he heard a loud, thunderous noise, which he took to be a sign from above. In the third dream, he found 2 books lying on a table. One was a dictionary, the other an anthology of poems. He opened the anthology and read the line, "What path shall I follow in life?" Descartes interpreted these dreams as a message from God, a confirmation that he was on the right path. The dictionary represented the sciences, all of human knowledge gathered together. The anthology of poems represented philosophy and wisdom united. The dreams, he believed, were calling him to a great work, a work of synthesis and discovery. Whether these dreams were truly of divine origin, or whether they were the product of an overheated imagination and a day of intense mental strain, we cannot say. What matters is that Descartes believed them to be significant. He saw them as a turning point, a moment when his purpose became clear. From this point forward, Descartes dedicated himself to the development of his method. He would spend years refining his ideas, years traveling, observing, and thinking. But the seed had been planted, the vision had been glimpsed, and René Descartes, the frail boy from La Haye, the student of the Jesuits, the gentleman soldier, was on the path to becoming one of the most influential philosophers in the history of Western thought. His journey had begun, not with a grand proclamation, but with a quiet question, a stirring doubt, and a dream in a cold room far from home. And it is from this beginning, from this seed of curiosity and wonder, that the ideas we will explore tonight will grow. After the revelatory winter of 1619, Descartes continued his travels across Europe. He spent time in Germany, in Italy, and eventually returned to France. These years, from roughly 1620 to 1628, were years of wandering, of observation, and of quiet, persistent thought. Descartes did not rush to publish his ideas. He was not seeking fame or recognition, at least not immediately. Instead, he was engaged in a process of self-education, of refining his method, of testing his insights against the realities of the world around him. He attended scholarly gatherings. He met with other thinkers, scientists, and mathematicians. He observed the workings of society, the customs of different peoples, the variety of human beliefs and practices. And all the while, he continued to meditate, to think, to apply his developing method to various problems. During this period, Descartes also pursued specific scientific investigations. He worked on optics, the study of light and vision. He conducted experiments with lenses and mirrors. He sought to understand refraction, the bending of light as it passes from one medium to another. These investigations were not idle curiosities. They were part of Descartes' larger project, his attempt to apply mathematical reasoning to the study of nature. By the mid-1620s, Descartes had formulated the outlines of his method, though he had not yet committed it fully to writing. He had developed a set of rules for directing the mind toward truth, rules that emphasized clarity, order, and systematic analysis. These rules were, in essence, an attempt to extend the certainty of mathematics to all areas of knowledge. In 1628, Descartes attended a gathering in Paris, where a lecture was given by a certain Monsieur de Chandoux, a chemist. Chandoux presented a system of philosophy that challenged the traditional scholastic teachings. After the lecture, there was a discussion, and most of those present were impressed by Chandoux's arguments. But Descartes was not impressed. When asked for his opinion, he criticized Chandoux's method. pointing out that arguments that seem persuasive can lead to false conclusions if they are not built on certain foundations. He then gave an impromptu demonstration of his own method, showing how one could distinguish true from false reasoning by applying strict criteria of clarity and evidence. Among those present at this gathering was Cardinal Pierre de Bérulle, a prominent figure in the French Catholic Church and a man of considerable influence. Bérulle was deeply impressed by Descartes' performance. He approached Descartes afterward and urged him, almost commanded him, to develop and publish his method for the benefit of all. Bérulle saw in Descartes' approach a way to defend the faith against skeptics and heretics, a way to establish religious truths on a firm, rational foundation. This encouragement from Bérulle, combined with Descartes' own sense of having something important to contribute, spurred him to more focused work. He decided to leave France and settle in the Dutch Republic, where he could work in relative peace and seclusion, away from the distractions and potential controversies of Parisian intellectual life. And so, in 1628 or 1629, Descartes moved to the Netherlands. He would remain there, with only occasional trips elsewhere, for most of the rest of his life. The Dutch Republic offered religious tolerance, intellectual freedom, and a thriving culture of science and commerce. It was an ideal environment for a thinker seeking to develop new ideas. In the Netherlands, Descartes lived quietly, often moving from one small town to another to maintain his privacy. He corresponded extensively with scholars across Europe, engaging in debates, sharing ideas, and refining his thoughts through dialogue. But his primary work was done alone, in the stillness of his own mind. During the early 1630s, Descartes worked on a comprehensive treatise on natural philosophy, which he called The World, or Treatise on Light. In this work, he attempted to explain the workings of the physical universe using only mechanical principles. He rejected the scholastic reliance on Aristotelian concepts like forms and final causes, and instead proposed that all physical phenomena could be explained by matter in motion, governed by mathematical laws. At the heart of Descartes' cosmology was the idea that the universe was filled with a subtle matter, a kind of invisible fluid through which forces were transmitted. Light, he proposed, was a pressure transmitted through this medium. The planets moved in great vortices, whirlpools of this subtle matter swirling around the sun. Descartes' system was elaborate and imaginative. It sought to provide a complete, mechanistic account of the cosmos. But in 1633, calm, measured tone. Just as he was preparing to publish The World, Descartes received troubling news. He learned that Galileo Galilei, the Italian scientist, had been condemned by the Roman Inquisition for advocating the heliocentric view of the cosmos, the view that the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the other way around. Galileo had been forced to recant, to publicly deny his teachings. He was placed under house arrest and his works were banned. The condemnation sent shockwaves through the European intellectual community. It was a stark reminder that certain ideas, no matter how well founded in observation and reason, could be deemed dangerous by religious authorities. Descartes' The World also embraced the heliocentric system. He had argued, based on his mechanical principles, that the Earth moved. Upon hearing of Galileo's fate, Descartes decided not to publish his treatise. He did not want to court controversy, to risk condemnation, or to bring trouble upon himself. This decision reveals something important about Descartes' character. He was cautious, prudent, perhaps even timid in matters of public confrontation. He valued his peace and his freedom to think. He had no desire to be a martyr for science, and so he set aside The World, and it would not be published in full until after his death. But Descartes did not abandon his ambitions to contribute to the advancement of knowledge. Instead, he turned his attention to a different kind of work, one that would present his method and his philosophical foundations in a way that might be less provocative, less liable to misunderstanding. In 1637, Descartes published a work titled Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences. This work, usually referred to simply as the Discourse on Method, was published in French rather than Latin, making it accessible to a wider audience beyond the scholarly elite. The discourse was presented as a kind of intellectual autobiography. Descartes described his education, his travels, his growing dissatisfaction with traditional learning, and his search for a new foundation for knowledge. He outlined the method he had developed, a method consisting of 4 simple rules. The first rule was to accept nothing as true unless it was so clear and distinct that it could not be doubted. This was the rule of evidence, the insistence on certainty. The second rule was to divide each difficulty into as many parts as possible, to break complex problems down into simpler, more manageable components. This was the rule of analysis. The third rule was to conduct one's thoughts in an orderly fashion, starting with the simplest and easiest to know, and gradually ascending to the more complex. This was the rule of synthesis, of building knowledge step by step. And the fourth rule was to make enumerations so complete and reviews so comprehensive that one could be certain nothing had been omitted. This was the rule of completeness. These 4 rules, simple as they might seem, were Descartes' prescription for achieving certainty in all areas of inquiry. They were based on the model of mathematical reasoning, where one starts with self-evident principles and derives conclusions through logical steps. But the discourse on method was more than just a statement of rules. It also contained, in its 4th part, the most famous argument in the history of modern philosophy, the argument that would come to define Descartes' legacy. It is the argument we have been moving toward all along, the argument that begins with radical doubt and arrives at the bedrock of certainty. To understand this argument, we must first understand the nature of Descartes' doubt. It was not the doubt of a skeptic, someone who doubts for the sake of doubting, who takes pleasure in showing that nothing can be known. Descartes' doubt was methodological. It was a tool, a technique, employed for a specific purpose, to clear away all uncertain beliefs and find something absolutely certain upon which to build. Descartes proposed to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. He would suspend his belief in anything that was not absolutely certain, no matter how probable or plausible it might seem. And he would do this systematically, examining the various sources of his beliefs and questioning whether they provided indubitable knowledge. The first source of belief, and the most obvious, is the senses. We believe the world exists around us because we see it, hear it, touch it. But Descartes pointed out that the senses sometimes deceive us. A stick appears bent when placed in water, though it is straight. Distant objects appear small, though they are large. Colours look different under different lights. If the senses can deceive us sometimes, Descartes reasoned, how can we be certain they do not deceive us all the time? Perhaps what we take to be reality is merely an elaborate illusion. One might object that while the senses can err about small or distant things, they are reliable about obvious matters, like the fact that I am sitting here, holding a piece of paper, with hands and a body. But Descartes raised a further possibility. He considered the fact that when we dream, we often have vivid and convincing experiences. In a dream, we might believe we are sitting by the fire, holding a paper, when in fact we are asleep in bed. How can we be certain at any given moment that we are not dreaming? In dreams, things seem real. We do not usually realize we are dreaming until we wake up. And so, Descartes suggested, it is possible that all of our experiences, everything we take to be waking life, might be a dream. This is a disorienting thought. If it is possible that we are dreaming, then we cannot trust our senses to tell us about the external world. The entire edifice of our everyday beliefs about physical reality is called into question. But Descartes did not stop there. He introduced an even more radical doubt, one that extended beyond the senses and the external world. He asked, what if there is a powerful, malicious being, a kind of evil demon, who is dedicated to deceiving me? What if this demon has arranged things so that whenever I think I perceive something, whenever I form a belief, I am actually being misled? This demon could make me believe that there is a physical world when there is none. It could make me believe that I have a body when I do not. It could even, perhaps, deceive me about the truths of mathematics. When I add 2 and 3 and get 5, what if the demon is manipulating my mind so that I make an error, so that I believe something false? This hypothesis of the evil demon, sometimes called the malicious genius or deceiving God, represents the most extreme form of doubt imaginable. It calls into question not only sensory knowledge, not only beliefs about the physical world, but even the reliability of reason itself. Faced with this level of doubt, it might seem that nothing can be known, that certainty is impossible. And indeed, many readers of Descartes have wondered why he went to such lengths to undermine the basis of knowledge. Was he, despite his protestations, a skeptic after all? But Descartes' purpose was not to remain in doubt. His purpose was to pass through doubt, to reach something that could not be doubted, something so certain that even the evil demon could not shake it. And he found it. Even if he is being deceived about everything, even if all his beliefs are false, even if an evil demon is manipulating his every thought, there is one thing that remains absolutely certain. The very fact that he is being deceived, that he is thinking these thoughts, that he is doubting, means that he must exist. A deceiver can deceive only something that exists. A thought can be thought only by a being that exists. Doubt itself presupposes the existence of a doubter. And so Descartes arrived at his foundational certainty, the one truth that survives all doubt, the rock upon which he would build his entire system of knowledge. He expressed it in Latin, cogito, ergo sum. In English, I think, therefore I am. This simple statement, this cogito, as it has come to be known, is the cornerstone of Descartes' philosophy. It is the first principle, the indubitable truth from which all other knowledge will be derived. What exactly does the cogito establish? It establishes that the thinking subject, the I who is doing the doubting and the thinking, necessarily exists. It does not yet establish that the body exists, or that the external world exists. Those matters are still in doubt, but the existence of the self as a thinking being is beyond question. Descartes went on to analyze what he could know about this thinking self. He concluded that he is a thing that thinks, a res cogitans. This thinking thing doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, and senses. These are all modes or activities of thought. But what is the nature of this thinking thing? Descartes concluded that it is not a body. The body is part of the physical world, and the existence of the physical world is still in doubt. But the existence of the thinking self is certain. Therefore, Descartes reasoned, the self must be something distinct from the body. It must be a mental substance, a mind or soul, whose essence is thought. This conclusion, that the mind is a distinct substance separate from the body, is known as Cartesian dualism. It is one of Descartes' most famous and controversial doctrines. It raises profound questions about the relationship between mind and body, questions that philosophers and scientists continue to grapple with to this day. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. For now, the important point is that Descartes has found his Archimedean point, his fixed and certain foundation. I think, therefore I am. From this single certainty, he will attempt to rebuild the edifice of knowledge. The method of doubt has served its purpose. It has cleared away all uncertain beliefs, all assumptions, all inherited opinions. It has reduced Descartes to the bare fact of his own existence as a thinking being. And from this starting point, he will seek to recover knowledge of the world, of God, of the nature of reality. But the journey from the cogito to a complete system of knowledge is not a simple one. It requires careful reasoning, and it involves arguments that have been the subject of intense debate and scrutiny for centuries. In the sections to come, we will follow Descartes as he takes these next steps, as he attempts to prove the existence of God, to establish the reliability of the senses, and to construct a new science of nature. For now, let us rest with the cogito. I think, therefore I am. It is a statement of stunning simplicity and profound depth. It tells us that whatever else we may doubt, we cannot doubt our own existence as thinking beings. And in a world of uncertainty, of change, of endless questions, this one truth remains, quiet and unshakable. Having established the certainty of his own existence as a thinking being, Descartes faced a new challenge. He had found his foundation, his Archimedean point. But a foundation by itself is not a building. He now needed to build upward from the cogito, to recover knowledge of the world, to establish truths beyond the mere fact of his own existence. The question that naturally arose was this: if I know that I exist as a thinking thing, can I know anything else? Can I move beyond the confines of my own mind and gain knowledge of things outside myself? To answer this question, Descartes turned his attention to the contents of his mind, to the ideas that he found within his consciousness. Even if he could not yet be certain that these ideas corresponded to anything real in the external world, he could at least examine the ideas themselves. Descartes distinguished between different types of ideas. Some ideas, he observed, seemed to come from outside himself. These he called adventitious ideas. For example, the idea of the sun or of a tree appears to come from the senses, from the perception of things in the external world. Other ideas seem to be invented by the mind itself. These he called factitious ideas. For example, the idea of a unicorn or of a golden mountain is constructed by the imagination, by combining elements from other ideas. But there was a third class of ideas, which Descartes called innate ideas. These were ideas that seemed to be part of the very structure of the mind, not derived from experience and not constructed by imagination. They were, in a sense, built into the fabric of consciousness itself. Among the innate ideas, Descartes identified one of particular importance: the idea of God. The idea of God, as Descartes understood it, is the idea of a supremely perfect being, infinite in knowledge, power, and goodness. It is the idea of a being who possesses all perfections to the highest degree. Now, Descartes asked himself, where does this idea come from? Could it be adventitious, derived from sensory experience? No, he reasoned, because the senses present us only with finite, imperfect things. We never perceive anything infinite or absolutely perfect through the senses. Could the idea of God be factitious, constructed by the imagination? Could I have simply made up the idea of God by combining other ideas, by imagining a being with greater and greater perfections, until I arrived at the concept of a supremely perfect being? Descartes argued that this, too, was impossible. To construct the idea of an infinite being from the idea of finite things would require adding perfections together. But no amount of adding finite perfections would ever yield the infinite. The infinite is not simply a very large finite, it is something qualitatively different, something beyond all finite measure. And so, Descartes concluded, the idea of God must be innate. It must have been placed in his mind by something outside himself, something with at least as much reality as the idea represents. This line of reasoning led Descartes to a crucial principle, which he called the causal principle of ideas. The principle states that an idea must have a cause that contains at least as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. Let us unpack this slowly and carefully. Objective reality refers to the content of an idea, to what the idea represents. For example, the idea of a horse has a certain objective reality because it represents a horse. The idea of God has a much greater objective reality because it represents an infinite, supremely perfect being. Formal reality, on the other hand, refers to the actual existence of the thing that causes the idea. A real horse has formal reality. A real God, if such a being exists, would have infinite formal reality. The causal principle of ideas says that the cause of an idea must possess, in its formal reality, at least as much perfection as the idea possesses in its objective reality. In other words, a lesser being cannot be the total cause of the idea of a greater being. Applying this principle to the idea of God, Descartes reasoned as follows. The idea of God is the idea of an infinite, supremely perfect being. This idea has infinite objective reality. But Descartes himself is a finite, imperfect being. He is prone to error, to ignorance, to doubt. His formal reality is limited. Therefore, Descartes cannot be the adequate cause of the idea of God. He cannot have generated this idea from his own resources. The only adequate cause of the idea of an infinite being is an actually infinite being. The idea of God must have been caused by God himself. And so, Descartes concluded, God must exist. The very fact that he possesses the idea of God is proof of God's existence. This argument is known as the trademark argument because it suggests that God has left his mark, his trademark, upon the human mind by implanting in it the idea of himself. This is a bold argument, and it has been the subject of much debate. Critics have questioned whether the causal principle of ideas is valid, whether the idea of God really possesses infinite objective reality, and whether a finite being truly cannot conceive of the infinite. But for Descartes, the argument was convincing. It provided him with a second certainty, a second fixed point in his reconstruction of knowledge. He knew he existed, and now he knew that God existed. But Descartes did not stop with the trademark argument. He offered a second proof of God's existence, one based on a different line of reasoning. This second proof is a version of what is known as the ontological argument. The ontological argument attempts to prove God's existence from the very concept or definition of God, without appealing to any empirical facts or causal principles. It is an argument from pure reason, from the analysis of ideas. Descartes' version of the argument goes like this. The idea of God is the idea of a supremely perfect being. To be supremely perfect means to possess all perfections. But existence is a perfection. It is better to exist than not to exist. A being that exists is more perfect, other things being equal, than a being that does not exist. Therefore, if God is supremely perfect, God must possess the perfection of existence. To conceive of God as non-existent would be a contradiction, like conceiving of a triangle that does not have three sides. The very concept of God includes existence as one of its essential attributes. And so, Descartes concluded, God necessarily exists. It is as certain as any mathematical truth. Just as we cannot conceive of a triangle without three sides, we cannot conceive of God without existence. This ontological argument has fascinated and perplexed philosophers for centuries. It seems almost too easy, almost like a trick. Can we really prove that something exists merely by analysing a concept? Critics, most famously Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, have argued that existence is not a predicate or a property that can be included in the definition of something. To say that God exists is not to add a property to the concept of God, but to assert that the concept is instantiated, that it corresponds to something real. But these debates, important as they are, came later. For Descartes, the ontological argument was a further confirmation of what he had already established through the trademark argument. God exists, and God is a supremely perfect being. Now, Descartes could take the next crucial step in his reconstruction of knowledge. If God exists, and if God is supremely perfect, then God must be supremely good. A perfectly good being would not deceive. To deceive is an imperfection, a defect, a kind of malice or limitation. Therefore, God is not a deceiver. The hypothesis of the evil demon, the malicious genius who might be leading Descartes astray, is now ruled out. God, being perfectly good, would not allow Descartes to be systematically deceived about everything. This was a pivotal realization. It meant that Descartes could begin to trust his faculties, his reason, and even, to some extent, his senses. If God is not a deceiver, then the cognitive faculties that God gave him must be, at least in principle, reliable. But Descartes was careful here. He did not claim that he could never be mistaken. Obviously, he made errors. He misperceived things, he miscalculated, he misjudged. But these errors, he argued, were not due to God deceiving him. They were due to the limitations of his own nature as a finite being, and to the misuse of his faculties. Descartes introduced a distinction between the understanding and the will. The understanding is the faculty by which we perceive ideas and grasp truths. It is limited in scope. There are many things we do not understand, many questions to which we do not have answers. But within its proper domain, the understanding, when properly used, is reliable. The will, on the other hand, is the faculty by which we affirm or deny, by which we give or withhold assent to propositions. The will, Descartes claimed, is not limited in the same way as the understanding. We can will to believe things that we do not fully understand. We can make judgments that exceed the evidence available to us. Error arises, Descartes argued, when the will outstrips the understanding. When we affirm something that is not clear and distinct, when we assent to a proposition without sufficient evidence, we fall into error. But this is our fault, not God's. God gave us free will, and we misuse it. If we restrict our assent to only those propositions that are clear and distinct, to only those ideas that present themselves to the mind with complete transparency and certainty, then we will avoid error. We will attain truth. This is the criterion of truth that Descartes established. Whatever is clearly and distinctly perceived is true. Clarity and distinctness are the marks of a true idea, the signs that it can be trusted. With the existence of a non-deceiving God established, and with the criterion of clear and distinct perception in place, Descartes now felt justified in trusting certain basic truths. The truths of mathematics, for example, are clear and distinct. When we see that 2 + 3 = 5, we perceive this with perfect clarity, and so these truths can be trusted. But what about the external world? What about the existence of physical objects, of bodies, of the material realm? Can Descartes now recover belief in the external world? He approached this question carefully. He noted that he had a strong, natural inclination to believe that his sensory experiences were caused by external objects. When he saw a tree, he naturally believed that there was a real tree outside of him causing that perception. When he felt warmth, he believed there was a fire nearby. But natural inclinations, by themselves, are not sufficient for certainty. Descartes had learned not to trust inclinations blindly. However, he reasoned, if God is not a deceiver, and if God gave him these natural inclinations, then they must, in general, be reliable. God would not have given him a strong, persistent, and seemingly irresistible tendency to believe in the external world if that belief were entirely false. That would be a form of deception, and God does not deceive. Therefore, Descartes concluded that the external world does exist. There are material objects, bodies in space, that exist independently of his mind and that cause his sensory perceptions. However, he noted that we must be cautious. The senses do not give us perfect knowledge of the external world. They can be misleading about details, about qualities, about the true nature of things. The senses tell us, for example, that sugar is sweet, that fire is hot, that grass is green. But these qualities, Descartes argued, are not in the objects themselves in the way they appear to us. Sweetness, heat, colour, these are secondary qualities, produced in us by the action of physical objects on our sense organs. What is real in the external world, what is objectively present in material objects, are the primary qualities: extension, shape, size, motion, and number. These are the qualities that can be described mathematically. They are the qualities that physics studies. And so, Descartes arrived at a picture of the physical world as a realm of matter in motion, governed by mathematical laws. This was the world that his treatise, The World, had attempted to describe, and it was the world that his new physics would explore. But there remained a puzzle, a deep and troubling puzzle that Descartes' system generated. If the mind is a distinct substance from the body, a thinking thing with no extension or physical properties, and if the body is a purely material substance, extended in space and governed by mechanical laws, how do they interact? We seem to experience such interaction constantly. When I decide to raise my arm, a mental event, an act of will, causes a physical event, the movement of my arm. When I step on a sharp object, a physical event causes a mental event, the sensation of pain. Mind and body seem to affect each other. But how is this possible if they are fundamentally different kinds of things? How can something non-physical cause something physical to move? How can something physical produce consciousness? This is the famous mind-body problem, and it is one that Descartes never fully resolved. He offered some suggestions. He proposed that the mind and body interact at a specific location in the brain, the pineal gland, a small structure near the center of the brain. He chose this because the pineal gland is singular, not divided into left and right hemispheres like most of the brain, and he thought this singularity matched the unity of the mind. But this proposal did not really solve the problem. It merely located the point of interaction without explaining how interaction is possible. Critics, both in Descartes' own time and ever since, have pointed out that positing a location for mind-body interaction does not address the fundamental difficulty. Despite this unresolved problem, Descartes had achieved something remarkable. He had, by his own lights, rebuilt the edifice of knowledge from the ground up. Starting from the single certainty of the Cogito, he had proven the existence of God, established the reliability of reason, and recovered belief in the external world. His system was a comprehensive vision, a new philosophy that broke with the scholastic tradition and set the stage for the scientific revolution that would transform Europe in the centuries to come. It was a philosophy that emphasized clarity, certainty, and mathematical reasoning. It was a philosophy that placed the thinking subject, the individual consciousness, at the center of the quest for knowledge. And it was a philosophy that would inspire and provoke thinkers for generations, sparking debates that continue to this day. The publication of Descartes' works, particularly the Discourse on Method in 1637 and the Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641, brought him considerable attention. The Meditations was his most thorough and rigorous presentation of his philosophical system. It was written in a personal, reflective style, as if the reader were accompanying Descartes on his journey through doubt to certainty. Descartes sent copies of the manuscript of the Meditations to several prominent theologians and philosophers, inviting their objections and criticisms. He wanted to anticipate potential criticisms and to demonstrate that his method could withstand scrutiny. The responses he received were published alongside the Meditations as a series of objections and replies. Among those who responded were some of the most distinguished minds of the age. There was Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher who would later become famous for his political philosophy. There was Pierre Gassendi, a French priest and scientist who defended an atomistic view of nature. There was Antoine Arnauld, a theologian associated with the Jansenist movement within French Catholicism. Each of these thinkers raised serious questions about Descartes' arguments. Hobbes questioned the Cogito, asking whether thought necessarily implies the existence of a thinking substance, or whether it might simply be an activity or process. Gassendi challenged the idea that Descartes could have a clear and distinct idea of God, given that God, being infinite, exceeds all finite comprehension. Arnauld raised what has come to be known as the Cartesian circle. He pointed out that Descartes uses the existence of a non-deceiving God to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But Descartes' proof of God's existence itself relies on clear and distinct perceptions. Doesn't this make the argument circular? Aren't we using clear and distinct perceptions to prove that clear and distinct perceptions are reliable? Descartes responded to this objection by distinguishing between what we clearly and distinctly perceive at the moment we perceive it, and our memory of having perceived something clearly and distinctly. He argued that we cannot doubt what we are actually clearly and distinctly perceiving right now. The cogito, for example, is certain at the moment we think it, but later, when we are not actively attending to the cogito, when we are simply remembering that we once clearly and distinctly perceived it, doubt might creep in. It is at this stage that we need God to guarantee the reliability of our memory and our cognitive faculties in general. Whether this response fully answers the charge of circularity is a matter of ongoing debate among scholars, but it shows Descartes' willingness to engage with criticism and to refine his arguments. Despite the challenges raised by his critics, Descartes' philosophy gained a wide following. His emphasis on reason, on individual inquiry, on the power of the mind to discover truth through reflection, resonated with the spirit of the age. The 17th century was a time of great intellectual ferment, a time when the old certainties of the medieval world giving way to new ways of thinking. Descartes' work contributed to this transformation. His mechanistic view of nature, his mathematization of physics, his dualistic separation of mind and body, all of these ideas would have a profound impact on the development of modern science and philosophy. In 1644, Descartes published another major work, The Principles of Philosophy. This was a comprehensive textbook intended to replace the Aristotelian textbooks that were still used in universities. It was divided into 4 parts, covering metaphysics, physics, cosmology, and the nature of earthly phenomena. In the Principles, Descartes presented his system in a more systematic and less personal way than in the Meditations. He began with his metaphysical foundations, the cogito, the existence of God, the distinction between mind and body. He then moved on to physics, explaining the laws of motion, the nature of matter, the structure of the cosmos. Descartes proposed 3 laws of nature. The first law stated that every body persists in its state of rest or motion unless acted upon by an external cause. This is essentially the principle of inertia, which would later be refined by Isaac Newton. The second law stated that motion in itself is always in a straight line. A body moving in a curved path, Descartes argued, is being deflected from its natural rectilinear motion by some external cause. The third law stated that when one body collides with another, it communicates to the other as much motion as it loses, provided the other body is less resistant. This was Descartes' principle of the conservation of motion, an early version of the conservation of momentum. Descartes used these laws to explain a wide range of phenomena, from the motion of the planets to the behavior of light to the workings of the human body. He viewed the body as a kind of machine, a complex mechanism whose operations could be explained in purely mechanical terms, without reference to Aristotelian forms or purposes. He even attempted to explain the functions of the nervous system, the circulation of the blood, and the processes of sensation and perception in mechanical terms. The body, he proposed, was like a clock or an automaton, capable of complex behaviors through the arrangement of its parts and the action of physical forces. But the mind, the rational soul, remained distinct. It was not part of the bodily machine. It was a separate substance, capable of thought, of reason, of free will. This dualism, this strict separation of mind and body, was central to Descartes' philosophy, but it was also the source of many of the difficulties his system faced. One of the most persistent critics of Cartesian dualism was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, a brilliant and thoughtful woman with whom Descartes carried on an extensive correspondence. Elizabeth pressed Descartes on the question of mind-body interaction. If the mind is entirely non-physical, she asked, how can it cause the body to move? How can something without extension exert force on something with extension? Descartes struggled to give a satisfactory answer. He acknowledged the difficulty, but insisted that the interaction was a fact of experience. We know, he said, that the mind and body interact, even if we cannot fully explain how. He suggested that the union of mind and body was a primitive notion, something that had to be grasped intuitively rather than explained in terms of other concepts. Just as we have a primitive notion of thought and a primitive notion of extension, we also have a primitive notion of the union of thought and extension in the human person. But this was more of an appeal to experience than a philosophical explanation. Elizabeth and many others remained unsatisfied. The mind-body problem would become one of the enduring challenges of philosophy, a problem that philosophers would continue to wrestle with long after Descartes' death. In the later years of his life, Descartes' fame continued to grow. He was recognized as one of the leading intellectuals of Europe. He received invitations to visit various courts and academies, but Descartes valued his solitude, his freedom to think and work without distraction. He generally declined these invitations, preferring to remain in the quiet of his Dutch retreat. However, in 1649, he received an invitation that he found difficult to refuse. Queen Christina of Sweden, a young and intellectually curious monarch, invited Descartes to come to Stockholm to be her tutor. She wanted to learn philosophy from the master himself. Descartes was reluctant. He was nearly 53 years old, in declining health, and he did not relish the idea of travelling to the far north, to a cold and unfamiliar land. But the Queen was insistent, and the honour of the invitation was great. Finally, he agreed. He arrived in Stockholm in October of 1649. The Queen, eager to make the most of his presence, scheduled their lessons for 5 o'clock in the morning. This was a considerable hardship for Descartes, who had maintained the habit since his youth at La Flèche, of staying in bed until late in the morning, using that time for meditation and thought. The Swedish winter was harsh. The palace was cold despite the fires that burned in the great hearths. Descartes, unaccustomed to such conditions and deprived of his morning rest, began to feel unwell. In early February of 1650, he caught a chill. The chill developed into pneumonia. Descartes' condition worsened rapidly. The doctors attended him, but their remedies were ineffective. On the 11th of February 1650, René Descartes died. He was 53 years old. His death came suddenly, cutting short a life that had been dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, to the quest for certainty, to the attempt to understand the world through reason. He was buried in Stockholm, but later, in 1667, his remains were returned to France and interred in the church of Sainte-Geneviève-du-Mont in Paris. Descartes' influence did not end with his death. On the contrary, his ideas spread throughout Europe, inspiring a generation of philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians. His method of doubt, his emphasis on clear and distinct ideas, his mechanistic view of nature, all of these became defining features of the modern intellectual landscape. In France, a group known as the Cartesians carried forward his work, defending and elaborating his system. Figures like Nicolas Malebranche developed Descartes' ideas in new directions, grappling with the problems his system had left unresolved. Malebranche, for example, proposed a doctrine known as occasionalism to address the mind-body problem. According to occasionalism, mind and body do not interact directly. Rather, on the occasion of a mental event, God causes the corresponding bodily event, and vice versa. When I will to raise my arm, God, observing my mental act, causes my arm to rise. This preserved the separation of mind and body while accounting for their apparent interaction. In England and the Netherlands, Descartes' ideas were engaged with, debated, and sometimes rejected by other great thinkers. John Locke, the English empiricist philosopher, criticized Descartes' theory of innate ideas, arguing that all knowledge derives from experience. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher of Jewish descent, accepted much of Descartes' framework but radically reinterpreted it, arguing for a monistic system in which mind and body were not separate substances, but different attributes of a single, infinite substance, which he called God or nature. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German polymath, engaged deeply with Descartes' work. He accepted the importance of mathematical reasoning and the search for clear and distinct ideas, but he rejected Cartesian physics, developing his own system based on monads, indivisible units of force and perception. And then there was Isaac Newton. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, revolutionized physics. Newton's laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation provided a mathematical framework for understanding the cosmos that far surpassed anything Descartes had achieved. Newtonian physics, based on careful observation, experiment, and mathematical analysis, replaced Cartesian physics as the dominant scientific paradigm. Yet, even as Descartes' specific scientific theories were superseded, his broader philosophical vision endured. His emphasis on the power of reason, his insistence on the need for a secure foundation for knowledge, his exploration of the nature of mind and consciousness, all of these continued to shape philosophical inquiry. Immanuel Kant, writing in the late 18th century, saw himself as addressing the questions that Descartes had raised. Kant agreed with Descartes that knowledge required a secure foundation, but he argued that this foundation lay not in the certainty of the cogito alone, but in the structures of the mind itself, the categories and forms of intuition that shape all human experience. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Descartes' legacy remained a subject of intense discussion. Phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl saw in Descartes' meditative method a precursor to their own approach. the careful description of the structures of consciousness. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre engaged with Cartesian themes of subjectivity, freedom, and the nature of the self. And in contemporary philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem that Descartes bequeathed to us remains very much alive. Neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and philosophers continue to grapple with the question of how consciousness, subjective experience, and mental phenomena relate to the physical processes of the brain. Some argue for forms of dualism, maintaining that mental states cannot be fully reduced to physical states. Others argue for physicalism, the view that everything, including consciousness, is ultimately physical. Still others explore alternative frameworks, seeking to dissolve or reframe the problem. But whatever position one takes, one is, in some sense, responding to Descartes. His framing of the issues, his way of posing the questions, continues to shape the debate. And the Cogito, I think, therefore I am, remains one of the most famous and widely discussed arguments in the history of philosophy. As we near the end of our journey through the life and thought of René Descartes, it is worth reflecting on what his philosophy accomplished and what questions it leaves us with. Descartes sought certainty. He wanted to place knowledge on a foundation so secure that nothing could shake it. Did he succeed? In some ways, the answer is yes. The cogito, the realization that one's own existence as a thinking being is indubitable, is a genuine insight. It is a point of certainty that is difficult to deny. Even the most radical skeptic, in the very act of doubting, affirms their own existence. But the cogito, by itself, does not give us very much. It tells us that we exist, that we are thinking beings. But it does not tell us what we are thinking about is real. It does not tell us that the external world exists. It does not, by itself, give us knowledge of anything beyond our own consciousness. Descartes tried to build outward from the cogito, to recover knowledge of God, of the external world, of the truths of mathematics and science. But each step of this reconstruction has been questioned. His proofs of God's existence, both the trademark argument and the ontological argument, rely on premises that not everyone accepts. The trademark argument, for example, depends on the causal principle of ideas, the claim that the cause of an idea must contain at least as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. But why should we accept this principle? It is not a self-evident truth. It is not something we clearly and distinctly perceive, at least not in the same way that we perceive the cogito. The ontological argument, with its claim that existence is a perfection and therefore belongs to the concept of God, faces the objection that existence is not a predicate. To say that God exists is not to attribute a property to God, but to assert that the concept of God is instantiated in reality. And even if we accept that God exists and is not a deceiver, the move from there to the reliability of our cognitive faculties and the existence of the external world is not as straightforward as Descartes suggests. A non-deceiving God might have given us faculties that are generally reliable, but still prone to error in many cases. The fact that we have a strong inclination to believe in the external world does not guarantee that it exists. So, Descartes' foundational project, his attempt to rebuild all knowledge from the ground up, starting from the cogito, is not without its difficulties. Many philosophers have concluded that his ambitions were too grand, that certainty of the kind he sought is simply not attainable. But even if Descartes did not fully succeed in his foundational project, his work remains immensely valuable. He changed the way philosophers think about knowledge, about the mind, about the relationship between thought and reality. He put the thinking subject at the center of philosophical inquiry, making the first-person perspective, the I of I think, the starting point for epistemology. Before Descartes, philosophy, especially in the scholastic tradition, was largely a matter of interpreting authoritative texts and constructing elaborate systems based on Aristotelian principles. After Descartes, philosophy became more centered on individual reason, on the careful analysis of ideas, on the attempt to think things through for oneself from first principles. This shift, often called the epistemological turn in philosophy, had profound consequences. It led to new questions, new methods, new ways of approaching old problems. It helped to create the intellectual climate in which modern science could flourish. Descartes' mechanistic view of nature, his insistence that the physical world operates according to mathematical laws, without purpose or final causes, was a crucial step in the development of modern physics. It freed scientists from the need to ask why things happen in terms of Aristotelian teleology, allowing them to focus instead on how things happen, on describing the mechanisms and the laws that govern natural processes. His work in mathematics was also significant. Descartes is credited with developing analytical geometry, the method of representing geometric shapes using algebraic equations. This allowed geometric problems to be solved using algebra and vice versa, bridging two areas of mathematics that had previously been largely separate. The Cartesian coordinate system, with its horizontal and vertical axes, is named after him, though the familiar form of this system was developed further by later mathematicians. This system is fundamental to much of modern mathematics and science, used everywhere from graphing equations to mapping the physical world. Descartes also made contributions to optics. He correctly explained the law of refraction, the relationship between the angles at which light enters and leaves a medium. He conducted experiments with lenses and prisms, and he developed a theory of the rainbow that explained its colors in terms of the refraction and reflection of light in water droplets. In all of these areas, mathematics, physics, optics, Descartes demonstrated the power of applying rigorous mathematical reasoning to the study of nature. He was not always right in his specific theories. His physics, with its vortices of subtle matter, and his rejection of action at a distance, was eventually replaced by Newton's more accurate system. But his general approach, his conviction that nature is intelligible, that it operates according to rational principles that the human mind can discover, became a cornerstone of the scientific revolution. It is no exaggeration to say that modern science owes a great debt to Descartes' vision. Yet, the very success of Descartes' mechanistic philosophy has led to new problems, new questions that we still grapple with today. If the body is a machine, if all its operations can be explained in purely physical terms, then where does the mind fit in? What is consciousness? What is subjective experience? Descartes' dualism, his separation of mind and body into two distinct substances, was an attempt to preserve the reality and dignity of the mind, of thought, of consciousness. But the cost of this dualism was the mind-body problem, the seemingly intractable puzzle of how two fundamentally different kinds of things could interact. In the centuries since Descartes, philosophers and scientists have explored many different approaches to this problem. Some have tried to eliminate one side of the dualism, arguing that everything is really mental, or that everything is really physical. Others have tried to find ways to integrate mind and body without reducing one to the other. Contemporary neuroscience, with its detailed maps of brain activity and its ability to correlate mental states with neural processes, has made tremendous progress in understanding the physical basis of thought and consciousness. But the hard problem remains. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to be conscious? This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by the philosopher David Chalmers. We can explain in increasing detail how the brain processes information, how neural networks give rise to behavior, how sensory input is transformed into motor output, but explaining why these processes are accompanied by subjective experience, by qualia, by what it feels like to see red or to feel pain. This remains elusive. Descartes' dualism, for all its problems, at least took consciousness seriously. It insisted that mind, that thought, that subjective experience was real and irreducible. Whether or not we accept his solution, we are still grappling with the problem he identified. Another enduring aspect of Descartes' legacy is his emphasis on the importance of method. The discourse on method, with its 4 simple rules, was an attempt to codify a procedure for thinking clearly and avoiding error. Descartes believed that if one followed the right method, if one started with clear and distinct ideas and proceeded step by step, one could attain certainty. This confidence in method, in the power of systematic reasoning, has been both inspiring and, at times, problematic. It inspired the development of formal logic, of scientific methodology, of rigorous standards of proof in mathematics. But it has also led, at times, to an overconfidence in the power of reason, to a neglect of the roles of imagination, intuition, and experience in the pursuit of knowledge. Descartes' rationalism, his belief that reason alone, unaided by the senses, could discover fundamental truths, was challenged by empiricists like John Locke and David Hume, who argued that all knowledge ultimately derives from sensory experience. This debate between rationalism and empiricism, between those who emphasize reason and those who emphasize experience, has been a central theme in the history of philosophy, and it is a debate that continues, in various forms, in contemporary philosophy. In epistemology, we still ask, what is the role of reason versus experience in the acquisition of knowledge? In philosophy of science, we debate the relationship between theoretical reasoning and empirical observation. In ethics, we ask whether moral truths can be known through reason, or whether they are based on sentiment, culture, or other non-rational factors. Descartes did not settle these questions, but he framed them. He brought them to the forefront of philosophical discussion, and in doing so, he helped to define the agenda of modern philosophy. There is also a personal dimension to Descartes' legacy, a dimension that has to do with the image of the philosopher, the thinker, the person engaged in the quest for truth. Descartes, in the Meditations, presents himself as a solitary individual, sitting by the fire, meditating, doubting, questioning, seeking certainty. This image of the philosopher as a lone thinker, reflecting on fundamental questions in the quiet of their own mind, has become iconic. It captures something important about the philosophical enterprise, the need for independent thought, for critical examination of received opinions, for the courage to question everything. But it also raises questions. Is this solitary approach the best way to seek truth? Or is knowledge a collective endeavor, something that emerges from dialogue, from debate, from the sharing of ideas? Descartes himself engaged extensively in correspondence and debate with other thinkers. He did not, in practice, work in isolation. Yet, the image of the solitary meditator, the individual thinker alone with their thoughts, remains powerful. It reminds us that each of us ultimately must think for ourselves, must take responsibility for our own beliefs, must be willing to doubt and to question. Descartes' call to doubt everything, to accept nothing on authority, to seek clear and distinct ideas, is a call to intellectual autonomy. It is a call to use our own minds, to trust our own reason, to not simply accept what we are told, but to think things through for ourselves. This call, in the context of 17th century Europe, where authority, tradition, and religious dogma held enormous sway, was radical. It was a declaration of intellectual independence, a claim that each individual has the right and the responsibility to seek truth through their own reasoning. And this is, perhaps, one of Descartes' most enduring contributions. He championed the power of the individual mind, the capacity of each person to think, to reason, to discover truth. He helped to create a culture in which questioning, critical thinking, and intellectual independence are valued. Of course, this emphasis on individual reason has its own complexities and dangers. It can lead to arrogance, to the dismissal of the wisdom of tradition, to the neglect of the insights that come from community, from dialogue, from the accumulated knowledge of generations. But it also has been a source of immense progress, of liberation from superstition and dogma, of the flowering of science and philosophy. As we conclude our exploration of René Descartes, we can see that his legacy is complex, multifaceted, and still very much alive. He was a man of his time, shaped by the intellectual currents and the historical circumstances of 17th century Europe. But he was also a thinker whose ideas transcended his time, whose questions continue to resonate, whose insights continue to challenge and inspire. He sought certainty and found the Cogito. He sought to prove God's existence and offered arguments that are still debated. He sought to explain the natural world and developed a mechanistic physics that, while superseded, helped to pave the way for modern science. He sought to understand the mind and left us with the mind-body problem, a puzzle that remains at the heart of philosophy and cognitive science. Descartes was not infallible. He made errors, both in his reasoning and in his specific scientific theories. His system, for all its ambition and rigor, has gaps and weaknesses. But this does not diminish his importance. Philosophy is not about finding final, perfect answers. It is about asking the right questions, about thinking deeply and carefully, about engaging with the fundamental issues of existence, knowledge, and reality. And in this, Descartes excelled. He asked profound questions. He thought with remarkable clarity and rigor. He challenged the assumptions of his age and offered a new vision of what philosophy and science could be. His invitation to us, across the centuries, is to think for ourselves, to doubt what can be doubted, to seek clarity and certainty where it can be found, and to never stop asking questions. I think, therefore I am. This simple statement, this moment of certainty arising from the depths of doubt, remains a touchstone, a reminder that in the act of thinking, in the exercise of consciousness, we encounter something fundamental, something undeniable. And so, as we bring this lecture to a close, we leave René Descartes not as a figure frozen in the past, but as a living presence in the ongoing conversation of philosophy. His questions are our questions, his struggles are our struggles, and his commitment to the pursuit of truth through reason remains a guiding light. The night is quiet now. The ideas we have explored drift gently through the mind. Descartes, the frail boy from La Haye, the student who questioned his teachers, the soldier who dreamed of a new philosophy, the thinker who dared to doubt everything. His journey is over, but ours continues. And perhaps, in our own quiet moments, in our own meditations, we too will find certainty in the simple fact of our own existence, in the knowledge that we think, and therefore we are. For now, the thoughts settle. The questions remain, patient and quiet, waiting for another time. Rest now, let the mind be still, and know that in the stillness, in the quiet of thought itself, there is something certain, something real, something that cannot be doubted. But before we rest completely, let us take a final walk through some of the specific contributions that Descartes made to mathematics and science. Contributions that extend beyond his philosophical system and that continue to shape our world today. We have mentioned analytical geometry, the marriage of algebra and geometry that bears Descartes' name. Before Descartes, geometry and algebra were largely separate disciplines. Geometry dealt with shapes, with figures in space, with the visual and spatial properties of things. Algebra dealt with equations, with symbolic manipulations, with abstract relationships between quantities. Descartes' great insight was that these two domains could be unified. He realized that geometric curves could be represented by algebraic equations, and that algebraic equations could be visualized as geometric curves. This insight opened up entirely new possibilities for mathematical investigation. In Descartes' system, points in a plane could be described by pairs of numbers, coordinates, representing their distances from two perpendicular reference lines. A circle, for example, could be described not just as the set of all points equidistant from a center, but as an equation relating the coordinates of points x squared plus y squared equals r squared, where r is the radius. This might seem like a small thing, a mere change of notation, but it was revolutionary. It meant that geometric problems could be solved using the tools of algebra. It meant that algebraic equations could be understood geometrically. It created a bridge between two worlds, allowing ideas and techniques to flow back and forth. The Cartesian coordinate system, though not exactly in the form we use it today, was the foundation for this unification. Later mathematicians, building on Descartes' work, would develop it further, would extend it to 3 dimensions and beyond, would use it to describe motion, change, and transformation. Without analytical geometry, without this Cartesian synthesis, much of modern mathematics would be unthinkable. Calculus, developed by Newton and Leibniz later in the 17th century, depends fundamentally on the ability to represent curves as equations. Physics, which uses calculus to describe motion and change, likewise depends on this foundation. And so, when we graph an equation, when we plot data on coordinate axes, when we use a GPS system that locates us by coordinates on the Earth's surface, we are, in a sense, walking in paths that Descartes first traced. In optics, Descartes made important contributions to the understanding of light and vision. He formulated the law of refraction, now known as Snell's law, though there is some dispute about priority, as the Dutch mathematician Willebrord Snellius may have discovered it independently around the same time. The law of refraction describes how light bends when it passes from one medium to another, from air to water, for example, or from air to glass. It relates the angle at which light approaches the boundary between two media to the angle at which it continues in the second medium. Descartes' formulation of this law was based on his mechanistic theory of light. He conceived of light as a kind of pressure transmitted through a subtle medium. When this pressure encountered a boundary, the change in the properties of the medium caused the direction of transmission to change, to bend. While Descartes' underlying theory of light was incorrect, his mathematical description of refraction was accurate and has proven extraordinarily useful. It is the basis for understanding how lenses work, how our eyes focus light, how telescopes and microscopes magnify distant or tiny objects. Descartes also attempted to explain the rainbow, that beautiful arc of colors that appears when sunlight interacts with water droplets in the atmosphere. He conducted experiments tracing the path of light through spherical flasks of water to simulate what happens inside a raindrop. He was able to calculate the angles at which light is refracted and reflected inside the droplet, and to show that these angles correspond to the angles at which we observe the rainbow in the sky. He explained the primary rainbow and even the fainter secondary rainbow, which appears outside the primary arc with its colors reversed. Though Descartes could not fully explain why the rainbow displays the specific colors it does, his geometric and optical analysis was a significant achievement. It showed that a natural phenomenon, once thought to be mysterious or even miraculous, could be understood through careful observation, experiment, and mathematical reasoning. This was the essence of Descartes' approach to nature, to replace wonder with understanding, to show that the world, for all its beauty and complexity, operates according to rational, mechanical principles that the human mind can comprehend. In physiology, Descartes made bold, if not always accurate, attempts to explain the workings of the human body in mechanical terms. He dissected animals, observing their organs and trying to understand their functions. He studied the circulation of the blood, building on the discoveries of William Harvey, who had demonstrated that blood circulates through the body, pumped by the heart. Descartes proposed that the body functions like a complex machine, driven by the heat of the heart and the flow of what he called animal spirits, fine particles that flowed through the nerves. These animal spirits, he believed, were responsible for sensation, for the transmission of signals from the sense organs to the brain, and for the control of the muscles. When light enters the eye, Descartes theorized, it causes movements in the parts of the eye, which in turn cause movements in the animal spirits in the optic nerve. These spirits flow to the brain, specifically to the pineal gland, where the mind, the rational soul, perceives the sensation. Similarly, when the mind wills to move an arm, this mental act causes a change in the pineal gland, which directs animal spirits through the nerves to the muscles, causing them to contract and the arm to move. This theory, fanciful as it may seem to us now, was an attempt to bridge the gap between mind and body, to explain how a non-physical mind could interact with a physical body. It was part of Descartes' larger project of mechanistic explanation, of showing that the body, at least, could be understood as a machine. But Descartes' mechanistic physiology was limited by the scientific knowledge of his time. He did not know about electricity, about the electrical signals that actually travel through nerves. He did not know about neurons, about synapses, about neurotransmitters. His animal spirits were a speculative construct, filling a gap in understanding with imagination rather than evidence. Yet, despite these limitations, Descartes' approach was influential. His insistence that the body functions mechanically, according to physical laws, helped to establish physiology as a scientific discipline, distinct from metaphysical or mystical speculation about the nature of life. In his later years, Descartes turned his attention increasingly to questions of ethics and the passions. His final work, The Passions of the Soul, published in 1649, shortly before his death, was an attempt to explain emotions, feelings, and desires in terms that were consistent with his overall philosophy. Descartes identified 6 primary passions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. All other emotions, he argued, were combinations or variations of these 6. He explained the passions in mechanistic terms, as responses of the body to external stimuli, mediated by the animal spirits and the motions of the pineal gland. But Descartes did not view the passions as merely mechanical disturbances to be suppressed. He recognized that the passions play an important role in human life, guiding us toward what is beneficial and away from what is harmful. The passion of joy, for example, inclines us to seek out and maintain conditions that are good for us. The passion of fear warns us of danger and prompts us to take precautions. The key for Descartes was not to eliminate the passions, but to regulate them through reason. The rational soul, the mind, should understand the passions, should recognize their mechanical basis, and should guide the will to moderate them appropriately. A person who understands that anger is a passion arising from certain bodily states and perceptions can choose not to act on that anger impulsively. Instead, they can reflect on the situation, consider what is truly good, and direct their actions accordingly. This view of ethics, grounded in the regulation of the passions by reason, was not entirely new. It echoed themes from Stoic philosophy, from the teachings of ancient thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. But Descartes integrated these ethical ideas with his mechanistic understanding of the body, creating a system that was characteristically his own. Throughout his life, as if thinking aloud, Descartes maintained extensive correspondence with scholars, mathematicians, and philosophers across Europe. These letters are a valuable source of insight into his thinking, revealing nuances and developments that are not always evident in his published works. One of his most important correspondents was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, a woman of remarkable intellect and philosophical acuity. Their correspondence, which lasted for several years, dealt with some of the deepest questions of Descartes' philosophy, particularly the mind-body problem. Elizabeth pressed Descartes on the difficulty of explaining how an immaterial mind could cause changes in a material body. She pointed out that all known cases of causation involve contact, one body pushing or pulling another. But how can something without extension, without spatial properties, make contact with something extended? Descartes struggled to answer this question satisfactorily. He tried various approaches, suggesting at times that we should think of the mind-body union as a primitive notion, not analyzable in terms of other concepts. At other times, he appealed to our direct experience of the union, arguing that we know the mind and body interact, even if we cannot fully explain how. Elizabeth was not entirely convinced by these answers, and her critiques highlight one of the enduring weaknesses of Cartesian dualism. But the correspondence itself is valuable, showing Descartes grappling seriously with objections, refining his views, and engaging in genuine philosophical dialogue. Another significant correspondent was Father Marin Mersenne, a Minim friar and a central figure in the European intellectual network of the time. Mersenne acted as a kind of clearinghouse for ideas, corresponding with scholars across Europe, disseminating new discoveries and facilitating debates. Through Mersenne, Descartes remained connected to the wider world of learning, even as he lived in seclusion in the Netherlands. Mersenne gathered objections to Descartes' meditations from various thinkers and sent them to Descartes for reply. He arranged for the publication of Descartes' works and defended him against critics. This network of correspondence was essential to the intellectual life of the 17th century. In an age before academic journals, before professional conferences, before the internet, ideas were shared through letters, painstakingly written by hand, carried by messengers across vast distances, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach their destinations. And yet, despite these barriers, ideas travelled and spread. Descartes' philosophy reached England, where it influenced thinkers like Henry Moore and Ralph Cudworth. It reached the Netherlands, where Spinoza encountered it and transformed it. It reached Germany, where Leibniz engaged with it critically and constructively. It shaped the intellectual landscape of Europe and, eventually, of the entire world. As we draw close to the end of our journey through Descartes' life and thought, we might reflect on what it means to call him the father of modern philosophy. This is a title often bestowed upon him, and it captures something important, though it should not be taken too literally. Descartes was not the first philosopher of the modern era. He had predecessors who also challenged scholastic orthodoxy, who also sought new foundations for knowledge. Francis Bacon, in England, had advocated for an empirical, experimental approach to science. Michel de Montaigne, in France, had explored skepticism and the limits of human knowledge. But Descartes brought together several threads, several concerns and approaches in a way that defined the agenda for philosophy for centuries to come. His emphasis on the individual thinking subject, on the search for certainty, on the role of reason, on the mechanistic explanation of nature, these became the hallmarks of modern philosophy. And his method, his approach of radical doubt, followed by systematic reconstruction, became a model, even for those who disagreed with his specific conclusions. Philosophers after Descartes might reject his dualism, might question his proofs of God, might challenge his rationalism, but they did so within a framework that Descartes had helped to establish. The questions he raised about knowledge, about the mind, about the relationship between thought and reality, these remain central to philosophy. The cogito, I think, therefore I am, remains a touchstone, a statement that every philosophy student encounters, that every thoughtful person must, at some point, consider. And Descartes' vision of a unified science, grounded in mathematics and dedicated to understanding the natural world through reason and observation, this vision, though modified and refined over the centuries, is recognizably the vision that animates modern science. So yes, Descartes is rightly called the father of modern philosophy, not because he created it from nothing, not because everyone after him agreed with him, but because he shaped its questions, its methods, its aspirations in ways that proved enduringly influential. And what of Descartes the person? What can we say about the man behind the philosophy? The historical record gives us glimpses, but there is much we do not know. He was, by all accounts, a private person, guarded about his personal life, careful about his public reputation. We know he never married. We know he fathered a daughter, Francine, with a servant woman, Helena Jans van der Strom, in the Netherlands. He loved this daughter deeply. Her death from scarlet fever at the age of 5 in 1640 was, he said, the greatest sorrow of his life. This loss reveals a tenderness, an emotional depth, but is not always apparent in his philosophical writings. For all his emphasis on reason, on the regulation of the passions, Descartes was not a cold or unfeeling person. He wept at Francine's death. He felt deeply. He was human. In his daily life, Descartes maintained his habit of lying in bed until late morning, using those hours for meditation and thought. He was meticulous in his work, careful in his experiments, rigorous in his reasoning. He enjoyed mathematics, finding in it a beauty and certainty that delighted him. He was cautious about controversy, as we have seen in his decision not to publish The World after Galileo's condemnation. He valued his freedom to think and work without interference. He did not seek martyrdom. He was prudent, perhaps even timid, in matters of public confrontation. Yet he was also courageous in his intellectual pursuits, willing to question everything, willing to start from scratch, willing to follow his reasoning wherever it led. This took a different kind of courage, the courage of the mind rather than the body. And in his final years, despite his caution, despite his love of solitude and peace, he accepted the invitation of Queen Christina of Sweden, travelling to Stockholm to serve as her tutor. Perhaps he was flattered by the attention of royalty. Perhaps he hoped to gain support for his work. Perhaps he simply felt he could not refuse. Whatever his reasons, the move proved fatal. The harsh Swedish winter, the early morning lessons, the disruption of his carefully maintained routine, these took their toll on his health. He contracted pneumonia and died on February 11th, 1650, far from his beloved Netherlands, far from the quiet retreats where he had done his best work. His body was eventually returned to France, though not without complications and delays. His remains were reburied several times over the centuries. There are even stories, perhaps apocryphal, that his skull was separated from his body at some point and passed through various hands before ending up in a museum in Paris. These posthumous travels and misadventures seem almost undignified, a strange fate for someone who had spent his life seeking certainty and order. But perhaps they are fitting in another way. a reminder that even the greatest philosophers are mortal, that their bodies are subject to the same mechanical laws and eventual decay as all material things. What endures is not the body, but the ideas, the thoughts, the insights. And these, Descartes believed, belong to the mind, to the realm of thought, which is not subject to the same limitations as matter. Whether or not we accept Descartes' dualism, whether or not we believe in an immaterial soul that survives the death of the body, there is a sense in which his ideas do live on. They live on in the books that preserve them, in the students who study them, in the thinkers who engage with them, challenge them, build upon them. René Descartes, the frail boy from La Haye, the student of the Jesuits, the soldier who dreamed of a new philosophy, the thinker who dared to doubt everything. His mortal life ended in Stockholm in 1650, but his intellectual life continues wherever people think, question, and seek understanding. I think, therefore I am. These words, spoken across the centuries, remain. They echo in the quiet spaces of thought. They remind us of our own existence, of the undeniable reality of consciousness, of the mystery and the certainty of being. And so, as the night deepens, as the mind grows still, we can rest with this knowledge. We think, we are. And in that simple, profound truth, there is something solid, something real, something that cannot be swept away by any doubt. Rest now. Let the questions remain, peaceful and patient. Let the thoughts settle like snow falling softly on a winter night. And know that in the morning, when you wake, the world will be there, waiting to be understood, waiting to be explored, just as Descartes believed it would be. I think, therefore I am. Therefore I rest. And so it is time to rest.